or bad about the free thought community. You know, it's just interesting little tidbits about the different things you find on the other side, but talking to his mother and learning about the different aspects through her. There's another question?
Yeah, what's the evidence that Ingersol was a Mason?
We know he was a Mason. Actually, Tom corrected that this morning.
You said about a sword.
Yes, but he was still a member of the group. It doesn't necessarily mean he actually followed all the beliefs. I know it was more of a social club than his.
Well, yeah, this was Ingersol towards the end of his time in Peoria was beginning to emerge as a national figure, and he was probably the celebrity lawyer in Peoria. And I imagine that any community group that he wanted into would welcome him with open arms at that point. And that appears to be what happened with the Masons. Now, the only way you get one of those swords with your name inscribed on it is by joining the Masons. I'm not familiar with a tremendous amount of the Masonic lore, but I think you had to work your way through 3 or 4 levels of achievement within Masonry in order to be issued one of those swords. So whether whether the tests were being kind of doctored for him so he could march right through and get the sword, nobody knows. But he was an official Mason in Peoria, and we know that much about it. Now that is interesting because one of the at that time, and I believe even today, Masonry doesn't require that you be Christian, but it does require that you affirm a belief in a supreme being. And again, we don't know whether someone was whistling very loudly at that point in the ceremony, but Ingersol had the sword.
I watched a recent Discovery Channel show on Masonry, I believe, and there was a gentleman, Conrad Gehringer from the American Atheist, was a big part of that show, but he was not a Mason, and they made a big deal of the point that I'm a Mason or I'm not a Mason, and the thing was, he could never belong because he is affiliated with American Atheists.
I've read a lot on Masonry, and I think people that adopted even a pantheist view would probably be able to pass into Masonry. So depending on the...
There's a liberal Masonry and
so,
also another...
Right, and I think that's changed a lot since the beginnings, but it seems to be, as long as there's a belief in something up beyond
something
the world.
greater, I think.
Yes. Yes, sir.
There are certain people in Masonry, certain leaders that can make other Masons on site.
Tom, you're a Mason.
Well, maybe Ingersol got Masonized. It's actually, when you look at his legal career, it's amazing the ingenuity that many of his high-profile clients were able to exhibit to find ways of recompensing him that did not involve giving him cash. One of his clients gave him an operating cattle ranch in New Mexico, where he went to live one season. Decided he really hated cattle ranching in New Mexico and never went back. So who knows? Maybe someone made him a Mason. We don't have a lot of documentary evidence from that period. In fact, very little. There are a few records dating back to the Illinois Historical Society of cases that Bob and his brother Eben tried in Peoria. But really, Ingersol emerges onto the national record when he raises a Civil War regiment, and then particularly when he's paroled out of the war and begins to attract attention as a speaker who basically went around the country doing the equivalent of selling war bonds for the Union. Because during about the last year and a half of the war, he'd been paroled, so he couldn't fight. So he went out on the speaking tour and became quite prominent as Colonel Ingersol, at a time when most of the people who were entitled to an award like that couldn't very well go out on lecture tours because they were still fighting.
Well, you don't have to be Christian to be a Mason. You can be Muslim or Jewish.
Right.
Or
You just have to have some belief in a higher being.
in a higher being, yeah. It doesn't have to be God, some sort of higher being.
Yes.
Has there been much published literature, was there during his lifetime against him? And is that collected in one?
Yeah, I mentioned Talmadge. That was one of the things, that was a big rebuttal that he had done it. The gentleman was from Brooklyn who was denouncing him from the pulpit, and that was Ingersoll's response. I don't know if he ever went out and talked about it, but he strictly gave this interview that was a written document of this, and it was his point-to-point statements of saying, this is why Talmadge is wrong, why is he taking because of this, and that was that. And he was, quite often, there was a lot of literature like that, yes, there is.
So it hasn't been collected in any sort of,
Well, when we look for it, of course, at the center, and I find those sort of things. I don't know of any place that has a particular collection of just those items, but it would be worth looking into to see where we could possibly get other ones.
In Stein's checklist, doesn't he have one list of critical works?
Yes, he does. That was what was known when Gordon was going through it, and then I think we found, I found at least 8 or 10 that he had actually written on his materials that not included in Stein. We had to add them to him at another point. So there's lots of things he never found in addition to that. So
Some of these species were intensely local. Ingersol would come through, Kankakee, and some local pastor interested in making a bigger name for his ministry would publish a booklet just in the local area, excoriating Ingersol for the things he'd said. In many cases, Ingersol probably never even knew it came out. But there was one interesting one. There was a fellow named Reverend Lambert, who was based out of Rochester, who took on wrote a book called Tactics of Infidels, going through most of Ingersoll's speeches on religion and criticizing them point by point. And Ingersoll actually penned a brief reply to that. Lambert, in the meantime, wound up, ended his preaching days in a fairly low-profile posting in a small church in Waterloo. He'd had a disagreement with the bishop in Rochester and had publicly called the bishop a polecat in Latin. So, something Historia says, even in Latin it looks nasty.
yes, sir.
There's a lot of things in masonry that haven't changed in 200 or 300 years. And swords aren't, currently I don't think swords are used until you get about 11 to 15th degree. So, but I don't know how far back that would go.
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with masonry to be able to tell you anything. I just know we have the Masonic sword in the museum, but beyond that, I don't know how he got it or any of that information.
I read that it was a gift.
It was a gift.
Yeah. I can't imagine Ingersoll being a Mason. But the early Peoria days, anything
Right.
could happen. If you read Madeline Mary O'Hara on Ingersoll in his earlier days, but he didn't straighten out until he met his wife Eva. He was quite a character, bonfires on the street and that sort of. He was pretty wild. Nothing to do with women. He was good, I could see.
Just a rabble rouser, generally.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Probably the caption was, only a non-believer can remove the sword from the stone.
By the way, when you're doing the Freethought Trail, I know of one other Masonic sword of apparently exactly the same model, and it's hanging in the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls. I think it was perhaps owned by the husband of one of the honorees, and about all else I can say about it is it's in a slightly better state of restoration than ours. Our next project, when we have some spare money we don't need, is to get that all cleaned off, and there's some ornamental chain work that would need to be replaced.
Anything else?
This is a first event that I've hosted.